as well rather quickly.
The president helped get the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed. The economy has been on a tear. The stock market has certainly been on a tear. Would he, I mean, if you were advising him in the White House, would he be better to leave the Russia investigation alone? Because it seems like every time he tweets about it, it just causes his political enemies to go into a frazzle.
Well, on the one hand, I think the president is doing a good job of making clear there is no collusion, and I think people are inclined to agree with that. The bigger issue, though, is if you're a Republican running for re-election in 2018, you want to be known for the laws you've passed, the people you've helped, the things you've accomplished, the growth in the economy, the bonuses people are getting, the raise in wages. That's what you want to be known for. Policies, laws. The president wants to be known for himself. He wants the elections to be about him, his personality, his style, how he's changing Washington. But he's not on the ballot in 2018. So I think the more Republicans and the president can focus on laws, policies, and the good things in the economy, the less on individual personalities, including the president's, the stronger Republicans will be in 2018.
And we will see what comes of the president's assertion that there is no collusion, because multiple investigations still underway. Ari Fleischer. Ari, thank you.
So just weeks after the state's largest wildfire, deadly mudslides slam into a Southern California community, killing 17 people. How survivors describe the devastation left behind. 17 people killed, 8 others remain missing at this hour after devastating mudslides slammed into one of the wealthiest communities in Southern California. 65 homes in Montecito were destroyed and more than 400 damaged after these flash floods literally ripped through hillsides, stripping bare of vegetation by last month's Thomas wildfire. Thousands have been forced out of their homes as rescue crews now race to find any remaining survivors.
It's apocalyptic. I had no idea that the devastation was like this. It sounded like a hurricane or a freight train coming through. I mean, this is just, I can't quite believe it.
So far, rescue crews have covered about 75% of the inundated area.
Any solution has to include the wall, because without the wall, it all doesn't work. You can look at other instances, look at what happened in Israel. They put up the wall, they solved a very major problem. We need the wall. We have to have the wall for security purposes. Security is number one. And so the answer is have to have the wall.
President Trump sending a very clear message yesterday when asked if he would agree to a deal on DACA with Democrats, a deal that he says must include funding for a wall along our southern border. Joining us now, Arizona Congresswoman Martha McSally, vitally involved in this issue. She serves on the Homeland Security and Armed Services Committees. So the president has said there are 4 things that are essential to any deal on immigration. He says you got to have more money for border security. You got to end chain migration. You got to end the visa lottery. And then you have to come up with some kind of an arrangement on DACA, or the so-called Dreamers. Sounds pretty reasonable.
Yes.
Are you inclined to go along with what the president has to say? And what about some in the opposing party?
Absolutely. We've been working on this now for months, and 4 of us, members of Congress in the House, introduced a bill yesterday that essentially covers the president's priorities. Look, I think Republicans are generally open to some sort of legislative move related to the DACA population, but there's a couple of priorities that have to be most important. One is we have to secure our border. I represent a border district. We have cartels trafficking through our communities. It's a public safety and national security issue, and we need to make sure we're not incentivizing more illegal activity coming across the border. So that's a reasonable request to include a border wall, and we've seen how barriers work in a district like mine. Additionally, we've got to make sure we've got agents and technology and a strategy that's going to work. Also in our bill, we've got ending chain migration, ending the visa lottery, cracking down on sanctuary cities and Kate's Law, and we've got a mandatory E-Verify and a guest worker program. These are very reasonable things that are really, we're asking to tie together with any DACA solution, and we're asking for our Democrat colleagues to get more reasonable and start negotiating with us in good faith.
But some Democrats have said, you know, it's DACA and nothing else. No strings attached. You got to pass DACA. You got to find a way to allow the Dreamers to stay in this country. What do you say?
It's not happening. First of all, they are trying to hold our budget negotiations hostage to this issue, and it's our military that is suffering the most. January 19th is when the government funding ends, and our military needs certainty and funding in the readiness crisis that we're in so that they can keep us safe. And I think it's unbelievable. I brought it up at the White House meeting that they are now trying to hold our military hostage so they can protect people that are here illegally. It doesn't make any sense, and the American people aren't going to go for it. The deadline is March 5th. Let's support our military, fund the government, and continue to negotiate in good faith. They have got to come off their unreasonable view that is DACA or nothing. It's not happening. We've got to secure our border. We've got to end Cheyenne migration, the visa lottery, and have these other fixes in place so that we make sure we're not in a situation with 800,000 more DACA people in the next 1 to 5 years. That is a reasonable approach that we have taken, and we're asking our counterparts to meet us there.
But as you know, there are many in the Democrat Party. I mean, California just voted itself a sanctuary state. So there are many who think that, you know, the notion of sanctuary cities is sacrosanct.
And it's irresponsible. Kate Steinle's family will be the first to tell you that because of the man who killed her, who had been deported 5 times. And when the federal authorities were begging, please let them come into the jail and get him, he was released again into the community. This is irresponsible, and it is a public safety threat to communities around our country, and we shouldn't be playing politics with American lives like that.
The folks in your district support the idea of a wall, or at least some kind of, you know, more effective border separation?
Those who live along the border will tell you when there was nothing before, no physical barriers, it was a free-for-all. The cartels were just driving and coming across anywhere they could. Now we have some physical barriers, and it has created a challenge, but we need more. There's places where it's Normandy defenses. You can step right over it. So a border wall in places where it's appropriate, combined with Border Patrol agents at the border and a good strategy, intel-driven operations and technology so that we can intercept, track, and get these guys as they're coming over. So this is something those who live along the border are dealing with every single day, and they're glad, and I am too, that we now have a partner in the administration, the White House, that is willing and able to secure our border once and for all.
As these negotiations go along, we're going to be keeping a very close eye on them. Congresswoman Martha McSally, Republican of Arizona. Thank you.
Thanks.
A dramatic heist in the heart of Paris. Thieves stealing millions in jewels from the Ritz Hotel, and police say some of them are still on the loose.
More than $5 million worth of jewelry stolen from the Ritz Hotel in Paris. French police still searching for at least 2 thieves. It happened Wednesday evening when authorities say 3 suspects entered the hotel through a side door. They were arrested, but 2 other accomplices took the merchandise and got away. Police say some of the items have been found. Several high-end jewelry stores in the area have been targeted in recent years.
So President Trump escalating his attacks on fake news and renewing his call for a federal libel law. It's an effort, basically, some critics call futile because it's largely regulated under state law, but a move the president says is important to help protect Americans. Listen.
Our current libel laws are a sham and a disgrace and do not represent American values or American fairness. So we're going to take a strong look at that. We want fairness. You can't say things that are false.
Often talks about strengthening libel laws when he is unhappy with his coverage. He is unhappy right now with the Wolf book. That was the reference to money pouring into the bank account. But he hasn't actually pushed any legislation, given everything that's on his plate. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah, most recently, the president's lawyers sent a cease and desist letter, letters, in fact, to the author, Michael Wolff, and his publisher before releasing the book. And that only backfired and prompted the publisher to release the book early. How could these libel laws, is he hoping, prevent authors from writing tell-alls about not just the president, but anyone for that matter?
Yeah, well, that book, that letter was a mistake because it gave, zillions of dollars in free publicity to the book, and there is no prior restraint under our legal system. But look, President said that nobody, meaning journalists, should be able to publish anything that is knowingly false. Well, that's already, I agree with that. That's already covered by current libel law. Even a public figure can file a libel suit if it can be proven that somebody, a reporter, an author, published something with reckless disregard for the truth and with malice. But But as a practical matter, a president, the ultimate public figure, can't be spending his time running around filing libel suits.
Okay, so he wants to file libel suits. He wants to personally be able to file libel suits if somebody prints something knowingly wrong. There's where the fine line between libel and crossing the line of the First Amendment comes into play, doesn't it?
Yeah, and look, Donald Trump in the past as a businessman has often threatened to sue, and he has filed a couple of suits against journalists. He sued a New York Times reporter for saying in a book that he was worth less than Donald Trump had claimed. He sued a Chicago Tribune critic, this is about 30 years ago, for saying that his proposed Trump Tower was an ugly monstrosity. But I think what we're really seeing here, Julie, is this is kind of like a brushback pitch in baseball. President trying to send a strong message to those who write about him, cover, pontificate about him, that he is going to push back hard against what he sees as unfair or untruthful criticism. And actually, he's got a much stronger tool than filing a libel suit, which tends to drag on in the courts for a long period of time. He's got the bully pulpit, and he's got the Twitter pulpit to push back against people like Steve Bannon, Michael Wolff, you name it.
Yeah, I mean, and the president, his private lawyers have threatened lawsuits, like you mentioned, to many people. I mean, the list is huge, and several journalists are among them, but they've never actually followed through on them. And I'm wondering what the message is there from the president and his legal team, or by going ahead and pushing forward this libel law legislation in 2018, if he's hoping to then go back to those lawsuits, hoping that they would stick, knowing that they possibly wouldn't under the current law.
Well, the problem with the libel law legislation is it would have to, in effect, overturn a landmark Supreme Court ruling about, as I mentioned, reckless disregard, public figure, and so forth. So I think that's unlikely. As far as actually filing, look, there would be a real disadvantage for the president or any politician in actually following through and filing a libel suit, legally entitled to do it, of course, and that is you open yourself up to discovery. Then you have to give a deposition. People in the White House might have to give a deposition. And also, rather than letting the original slander or libel or unfavorable or untruthful assessments kind of fade with the news cycle, the suit would keep it alive for months, and you end up shining a very bright spotlight on that which you're criticizing.
So then where does it infringe upon the freedom of the press? Is that something that could be a concern here that would, I guess, halt this from passing?
Well, freedom of the press enshrined in the First Amendment doesn't mean that journalists can do anything, but it does mean under Supreme Court rulings that they can't be restrained in advance from publishing something, even if it's untruthful. Now, the remedy for any citizen, including public figures, is then to go to court and file a libel suit. Again, for a president, I think it's kind of impractical. So instead, what Donald Trump is doing is sending a very strong message about unfair journalism, which, as you may have noticed, he tends to do every couple of days, sometimes every couple of hours.
Every couple of hours, I think, is more like it. All right, Howard Kurtz, great to see you as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
John.
Well, the U.S. flexes its military muscle, what we just deployed to the Pacific, and the message it is sending to North Korea. Plus, a guy going out to walk his dog gets attacked by a bear. He shares his terrifying story next.
Just in new military moves in the North Korea crisis, the U.S. deploying 3 powerful B-2 stealth bombers to Guam, a strategically important base, as Kim Jong-un tests his long-range missiles. All this despite the fact tensions on the North Korean peninsula have cooled off after North and South Korea held their first talks in more than 2 years.
We have certainly problems with North Korea, but a lot of good talks are going on right now, a lot of good energy. I see a lot of good energy. I like it very much, what I'm seeing. I think that we will have peace through strength. Our military will be stronger than it ever was in a very short period of time. And that's my opinion. That's not the general's opinion, but I think my opinion counts more right now.
Joining us now, Michael O'Hanlon, Director of Foreign Policy Research at the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much. Michael, I want to ask you, first of all, what intelligence the president there was referring to, and what is he sourcing his opinion on when he says that his opinion counts more than his general's opinions regarding where our military stands when it comes to North Korea? What is he saying?
Hi, Julie. Well, that's a tough question to open with. Of course, it's always hard to try to figure out where Donald Trump might be coming from with a comment like that. I think what he's trying to do is show a little bit of Reagan-like optimism about the strength of the United States. And, you know, obviously any politician's going to claim a lot of credit for what changes he or she has made. So Donald Trump's not unusual in that. He's been in office for 12 months. There have been some modernizations and improvements in the U.S. military. I don't think they've been dramatic. And I think the military was pretty good when he got to the White House. So maybe that's what he's referring to when he's claiming there have been dramatic changes, and the generals maybe are saying there have been modest but important changes. Either way, I don't think we have any major issues on the military front in terms of our capability towards North Korea.
Right.
And the three B-2 bombers that you mentioned going to Guam, you know, to some extent, that's almost normal crisis signaling that we've done over the years in regard to North Korea.
Right.
Obviously, everything now is on a little bit of, you know, thin ice, and people are very nervous about every move. I think the United States is trying to remind everyone that just because these talks between the North and the South in Korea are a little bit hopeful, we're not going to let down our guard, and they should not let down their enforcement of sanctions. So I think it's a combination of just trying to remind people not to get hopes too high and relatively normal signaling behavior by the United States in this kind of a situation.
Okay, we're obviously watching it closely, and talks have began. It's not the same. I mean, it's not the first time that this has happened, so obviously we can't let our guard down. But the U.S. Air Force, with their hard-line stance, talk about, you know, the deployment of those 3 nuclear-capable B-2 stealth bombers, and then in addition to that, 200 airmen to Guam, which is joining a number of B-1 conventional bombers already deployed there. What message exactly does it send about those talks? Does this strengthen talks possibly between the North and the South?
Well, in the broad scheme of things, I'm prepared to wish President Trump well, that his overall posture towards Korea, even though at times it scares me a little, may actually have created a sense of greater focus among some of the interested parties, and they've therefore applied sanctions more tightly, and therefore North Korea is a little bit more prepared to talk. All that is possible. And so I think, you know, I wish the president well. I'm not going to get into a debate about how much credit he deserves, because the main point is we are not yet anywhere near the finish line of where we need to be. In terms of those B-2 bombers, you can interpret in different ways. There are various kinds of attacks they can carry out, nuclear or conventional, as part of a big bombing campaign or as part of a very targeted bombing campaign, maybe against North Korean nuclear or missile infrastructure. But usually when we put bombers on alert like this or move them around, we're not necessarily even trying to be too concrete or specific about the kind of threat or attack we might be threatening. People can read that in if they want. We don't necessarily discourage them reading that in, but I think it's more just a general sense of reminding people about the need for vigilance.
And let's not just forget also, as I move on, the Pacific island of Guam is under direct threat. Kim Jong-un has said he has the nuclear capability to hit Guam. So certainly setting a strong stance there on behalf of our military is essential. I want to switch gears now to Iran, because President Trump is expected to keep sanctions relief for Iran, but he may be adding some penalties. First of all, how do you think sanctions are working out?
Well, I think that's the right policy, because I think that the sanctions in regard to the nuclear program and the lifting of those sanctions has been, you know, a necessary part of the nuclear deal. We all know the nuclear deal is very controversial and very partisan, but as Secretary Mattis and others have testified, now that it's sort of done and the rest of the world is relaxing the sanctions on Iran, it doesn't make that much sense for us to reimpose sanctions from that deal and risk losing the benefits of the deal. So even most Republican critics of the deal acknowledge there are some benefits. They just don't think the benefits were enough to justify all the lifting of sanctions. But the sanctions are now lifted, and even if we reimpose them unilaterally, the rest of the world is not going to. So I think President Trump is right to look for other kinds of sanctions on issues like ballistic missile development, on issues like Iran's support for terrorism. To your question about how well they're working, unfortunately, those sanctions have not produced a change in Iranian behavior yet, which is probably as bad as it's ever been in those areas.
The whole point of sanctions, is it not? So then the answer to the question is no, it's not working that well, because their nuclear ambitions are not being curbed, and that is the whole point here. But the president is also expected to announce new sanctions linked to human rights issues, which would obviously underscore U.S. concerns about Iran's response to recent anti-government protests there. Could this possibly help the people of Iran?
I think it's generally the right thing to do, even if, your question was, do sanctions only have any justification if they work in the sense of changing behavior immediately? And I'm not sure that's the only purpose of sanctions. I think sometimes they allow us to establish a moral high ground and also impose a cost so that a country like Iran has to think about what it's doing. And I think on the nuclear front, they have not curbed their ambitions, I agree with you, but they have changed their behavior because the nuclear deal requires that, at least for the next 8 to 10 years or so. On other issues like support for terrorism, suppression of their own people, development of ballistic missiles, the Iran nuclear deal does not require any change, and they have not made any change. But I still favor sanctions. And I think that President Trump is right to stand with the people of Iran, especially if we can do it with our allies and make a concerted international support for those kinds of human rights, even if there is no immediate change, because we have to stand on the right side of this issue morally in the first instance.
Yep, I agree. Michael O'Hanlon, thank you very much. Great to see you as always.
Thanks. Thank you, Julie.
One man counting his blessings after he lets his dog out of the house and ends up in a life or death struggle with a wild animal.
Came outside and he was right there. And I tried to run and it wasn't fast enough.
Man survives a bear attack that ends with 41 stitches to his face. Wow, the attack leaving the man with a facial laceration that required 4 hours of surgery. It happened Tuesday night outside the man's home in Naples. He says he stepped outside after letting his dog out, and that's when the 4-footed bear lunged at him.
Felt like somebody punched you. I mean, I didn't feel the cuts or anything. And it wasn't until I got back inside, looked down at my hand, and saw blood all over. I just tried to go like this to get back in, and it just did one of these, and I kind of flew that way and got my stuff together and somehow got in the door. I can't believe I just got hit by a bear.
Oh my God. Authorities say this is the first ever bear attack in South Florida. They have set traps in the area to catch the bear. No luck yet, though. Let's hope they catch him.
A Fox News alert. It is one of the most contentious issues on Capitol Hill these days, but the House has voted to reauthorize the controversial Section 702 FISA Act. That's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that sprung up after the horrible attacks of 9/11. The law allows the NSA and other foreign surveillance agencies to tap into the communications of Americans when they are communicating with foreigners overseas. It has been very controversial. The president himself tweeted out this morning that he felt that he had been caught up in FISA surveillance. Then he seemed to back off from that and tweet his support for it. At any rate, on a vote of 256 to 164, the FISA 702 Act has been reauthorized in the U.S. Congress. Democratic leaders facing some pushback in their own party over negotiations for a bipartisan DACA deal. Some rank-and-file Democrats want the focus to remain on so-called dreamers and border security. They fear top members of the party will give up too much to conservatives if the scope of immigration talks expands. But Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer insists the fate of DACA recipients remains the priority.
I was encouraged by what the president said at the White House today. The tone was very good, but the devil lies in the details, and we need the president to follow up on this meeting, which boded well. First, work on DACA and those narrow issues, then move on to the broader, more comprehensive immigration reform. That's a plan we agree with.
Let's bring in our panel. Michael Starr Hopkins is a Democratic strategist, an attorney, and contributor for The Hill. Steve Cortez is a spokesman for the Hispanic 100, who served on President Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council. He is also a Fox News contributor. Michael, it sounds like a little bit like Chuck Schumer wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to pass something for the Dreamers, but he doesn't want to do any other negotiating on any other issue. That's not how politics works, is it?
No, I think what Chuck Schumer is attempting to do is exactly what the president said he wants to do. He wants to focus on DACA first, make sure that those 800,000 individuals are protected and allowed to stay as they expected to be, and then we can focus on issues like the wall. I think the big issue here is if we're going to spend $18 billion on a wall that isn't necessary, then we need to be able to also authorize programs like the child health care program.
Well, you know, sticking with you for a minute, Michael, we just had Congresswoman Martha McSally on from Arizona. She says the wall is very necessary, and, you know, her district shows it.
Well, I'll take the president's words. Today he tweeted that illegal immigration is at an all-time low. Those two things don't seem to correspond.
All right. Steve, let's talk to you about the idea of settling on the DACA issue, the so-called Dreamers, and then talking about the fence and some other issues. Good politics,
right.
Good idea?
No, I think we need to do it all at once, John. And by the way, I really reject the term dreamers. I think that the left often tries to hijack the language. American citizens have dreams, too, so I'm not going to call them dreamers. However, I do want the DACA adults, and they're adults, too. The left always tries to call them kids. I do want the DACA adults protected. I think they're a different category of illegal immigrant. They didn't choose to come here. They were brought as children. Having said that, it's an absolute necessity that we get full control of our broken immigration system. We have to end chain migration, end the visa lottery, and absolutely build the wall. And by the way, the Democrats are being so disingenuous on the wall because they themselves voted for border walls. Chuck Schumer, for example, as recently as 2013, voted for hundreds of miles of barricades at the border. Back in 2006, a couple of senators named Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton voted for massive new border fencing. So they were for this before it became politically expedient for them to suddenly oppose securing our border.
Michael, it is true that for these children, again, he's right, they are adults now, but the so-called Dreamers were brought here as children illegally. Somebody broke the law to bring them here, right?
That is true. But those children, the people who were children at the time, they didn't break the law.
No.
And shouldn't have to suffer, go back to a country which they don't know, where they don't have family, where they don't have jobs. They're, in all sense of purpose, they're Americans. And so, you know, what I'll say to Steve's point about the wall, Democrats have voted to support technological advances in the wall. I support that. But what I don't support is a wall that covers, you know, over 200,000 miles of our border. That's not how we should spend our money. And Republicans, for a long time, have talked about fiscal responsibility. So let's do that. Let's be fiscally responsible.
But I don't really hear too many people, Steve, from either party who think that those folks who have grown up basically in America should be sent back to some other country. I mean, there are a handful, but it does seem like the fate of those who were brought here illegally, most legislators seem to want them to be allowed to stay here somehow.
Right, I agree, and I think there is consensus on that point. And by the way, the president showed great compassion in extending for 6 months and telling Congress, let's do this the right way, not the way President Obama did it. He pretended he was a king and he waved his scepter and did it by executive edict. That's not the way our process works, not how our Constitution works. Immigration laws have to be changed by the Congress and signed by the president. I'm confident that these people are going to be protected. I think they should be protected. But at the same time, we have to protect the national security and economic security of the United States. And our immigration system is not doing that right now. The majority of immigrant-headed households in the United States are receiving some form of welfare. That's a tragedy. It's a policy misstep. It's not the reality that our parents and grandparents faced when they came here as immigrants, wanting nothing but an opportunity. So we've got to fix it. I love immigration. Has to be legal, and let's be smarter about it and move to merit-based.
Well, Steve Cortes, Michael Starr Hopkins.
Thank you.
We have to leave it there. Thank you both.
Take care.
Thank you.
So the House just passed FISA reauthorization despite the president's tweet this morning criticizing the controversial program.